We now turn our attention to the field of developmental psychology, and we'll actually need 2 modules to cover this topic. In Module 7, I'll focus on development from conception through childhood, and in Module 8, we'll continue covering development from adolescence through late adulthood. In this first video, however, I'll start with some of the overarching issues and challenges present in the subfield of developmental psychology as a whole. First, recall that developmental psychology is the study of our cognitive, physical, and social development across the lifespan. Although certainly an interesting and important area of study, research in developmental psychology also presents some unique challenges. The first major challenge involves simply measuring our key variables of interest. Physical changes, like changes in height and weight, can be objectively measured without a lot of difficulty. And although these kinds of measures are expensive, researchers can also collect physiological data, such as brain scans and EEGs, for almost any age group. Psychological variables, however, present more of a challenge, especially when we're interested in studying these variables in young children and infants. So developmental researchers who study younger individuals often have to get creative in how they measure their variables. For example, one study was interested in babies' perceptions of physical attractiveness. In adults, physical attractiveness is actually a lot more objective than many people think. That is, on average, most people actually tend to agree on who the relatively more versus less attractive people are. For example, nearly everyone agrees that Hollywood movie stars like Brad Pitt are physically attractive. Even if you are not attracted to them, you can still agree that their facial features are pleasant to look at. But are our perceptions of physical attractiveness shaped primarily by our experiences, like our exposure to these kinds of stars in movies and TV shows, or is there something more basic about how we perceive physical attractiveness? To answer this question, researchers wanted to look at very young infants who haven't had much exposure yet to Hollywood celebrities. But how do you know what kinds of faces an infant perceives to be more or less attractive? Babies can't answer a self-report questionnaire, and at this young age, they can't even talk or point. But one thing young infants can already do is simply look. And just like we adults tend to look longer at things that are interesting, enjoyable, novel, or surprising, so do babies. So in this study, the researchers showed the babies 2 pictures, like these 2 tigers, displayed side by side, and the babies were free to gaze at either one. One of the images had previously been rated by a separate sample of adults as being more physically attractive. The researchers measured which image the infants spent more time looking at and found that babies tended to look significantly longer at the more versus less physically attractive image, indicating that perceptions of what makes something more physically attractive may be present even at a very young age. For some additional examples of studies that have used creative means to assess cognitive abilities in young children, you can check out the supplemental TED Talk video in Canvas. So one challenge in developmental psychology is simply trying to measure complex psychological constructs in babies and young children before they are able to write, speak, or even sometimes move voluntarily. Another challenge is even more basic. In developmental psychology, we are interested in how social, cognitive, and physical variables tend to change over time. And as it turns out, answering questions about how things change over time is a lot more complex than you might think. First, we have to define what we mean by change. A developmental change is a change that is due to aging, such as social and emotional growth in adolescence or cognitive decline in older adults. So, how do we measure developmental change? You might think that we could simply compare 2 different age groups, like measuring verbal ability in a group of 3-year-olds and a group of 1-year-olds, and then comparing the 2. This type of study design, when we measure multiple different age groups called cohorts at the same point in historical time, is called a cross-sectional study. So in the example study I just gave, we would have 2 cohorts, one cohort or group of 3-year-olds and a separate cohort of 1-year-olds. Let's imagine that our cohort of 3-year-olds displays greater verbal ability than our 1-year-old cohort. Is this evidence of developmental growth? Actually, not necessarily. The reason is because of something called cohort effects, which are a type of confound. A cohort effect is when change is not due to natural developmental processes, but rather generational differences between the cohorts themselves. For example, let's imagine that in our previous example study that we conducted this in March of 2021, about a year after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we might wonder if the greater verbal ability that we saw in the 3-year-olds was due to their developmental progress, or if it could instead be due to the fact that they were simply born prior to the pandemic. In a cross-sectional study, we are always comparing different cohorts at the same point in historical time, so it's impossible to know what is truly the cause of any observed difference. As another example, imagine a cross-sectional study comparing the personality variable conscientiousness, which is the tendency to be hardworking and responsible, among 3 different cohorts: a group of 20-year-olds, a separate group of 30-year-olds, and a third group of 40-year-olds. Furthermore, let's imagine that we found average conscientiousness levels to be higher in the older age groups. Again, there are actually 2 possible reasons for this difference. The first reason is that this could be a developmental change. That is, perhaps people do naturally become more conscientious as they age, and there is actually a few personality studies that support this conclusion. However, in our hypothetical study, this difference could also simply be a reflection of the different cohorts themselves. That is, it's also possible that the older generations were more conscientious, not simply because they were older, but because they had been born in a different generation and therefore had different kinds of experiences. For example, many older individuals who grew up during the Great Depression in the 1930s tend to be especially frugal and keep a lot of pantry staples on hand, perhaps because of the scarcity that they experienced while they were growing up. So, whenever we do a cross-sectional study, we always have to worry about potential cohort effects. That is, we can never know for sure if any differences that we observe are due to a developmental change or a generational one. In order to assess whether something is truly a developmental change, we need to actually measure the same group of people over time, and this is called a longitudinal study design. In a longitudinal study, researchers recruit a single cohort and follow them across months, years, or even sometimes decades. For example, let's return to our hypothetical study of verbal ability in children. The researcher might start the study in January of 2021 with a single group of 1-year-olds, and then follow that same group over the next 2 years until they turn 3. At multiple points along the way, the researcher could measure how verbal ability is changing in this single group of kids. Longitudinal study designs allow us to look more directly at change over time, which is often the very question that we're trying to answer. So now, if we see increased verbal ability in children when they are 3 years old, compared to when that same group of children was only 1 year old, we can be reasonably confident that this is indeed a developmental effect. As you might expect, longitudinal studies are relatively more expensive to conduct compared to cross-sectional ones, and so for this reason, longitudinal studies aren't always as commonly done. Another potential issue in longitudinal studies is that of attrition effects. In any longitudinal study, it's natural for some of the participants who started the study to drop out at some point. If the factors that influence participants to drop out are completely random, then there's no issue other than the loss in sample size. However, if the kinds of participants who choose to drop out of the study are systematically different than the kinds of participants who choose to stay in, and often this is the case, then this can threaten the overall validity of the study. A final limitation of longitudinal studies is that because we are only looking at one cohort, we can't be sure if the developmental changes that we observe will generalize to other cohorts. Again, going back to our hypothetical study, it's very likely that developmental changes in verbal ability will be different for children who were born during the COVID-19 pandemic compared to earlier generations. To address this final concern, researchers can conduct what is called a sequential study, which is basically a combination of both cross-sectional and longitudinal designs. In a sequential study, researchers measure multiple cohorts, as they would in a cross-sectional study, but they also measure all of these cohorts longitudinally across time, as in a longitudinal study. Sequential study designs are the most difficult to conduct in terms of time and resources, but they also give us the best of both worlds. Because sequential studies have a longitudinal component, we can more directly assess developmental change and rule out generational or cohort differences as a potential confound. However, because sequential study designs also look at multiple cohorts, we can also compare to see if different generations develop similarly or differently over time. For example, Jean Twenge is a developmental researcher who has done a lot of work looking at how teens today might be developing differently than teens did a few decades ago. She's found, for example, that compared to older generations, teens today tend to be less independent, take fewer risks, and have much higher rates of anxiety and depression. Although the reasons for these differences are still up for debate, Twenge strongly believes that many of these developmental differences are likely due to greater exposure to technology, and in particular social media, in younger generations. Okay, let's pause for a couple application practice questions before we close this video. First question. Imagine that Maria is conducting a study looking at decision-making in teens versus adults. She recruits two different groups of subjects, one group who are all around 16 years old and another group who are all around 22 years old. She then assesses the tendency to make risky decisions in each group. Which type of study design has Maria conducted? The answer is A, cross-sectional. This is because Maria has recruited two different age groups, or cohorts, and studied them both at the same point in historical time. Next question. Imagine that in Maria's study, she finds that the 16-year-old group makes riskier decisions compared to the 22-year-old group. Can Maria conclude that people tend to make less risky decisions as they get older? Explain why or why not. Maria cannot make this conclusion based on her study. This is because Maria conducted a cross-sectional study, and cross-sectional studies are vulnerable to cohort effects. This means that in a cross-sectional study design, we can't make definitive statements about developmental changes. All we know at this point is that there is a difference between the two groups, but we don't really know why. It could be a natural developmental change, but it could also be due to fundamental differences between the two cohorts themselves. In this video, we covered some of the basic issues of developmental research, including both measurement issues in babies and young children, as well as difficulties in assessing change over time in general. For the exam, you should be able to describe how researchers might measure psychological variables in infants and very young children, define and describe the three different types of study designs that we talked about, cross-sectional, longitudinal, and sequential. And for each type of study design, you should be able to discuss the benefits and drawbacks and be able to identify it in an example.